I watched a video the other day that said men move overseas because they have no game. And when I heard that, I kind of laughed. Not because I was offended, not because I felt attacked, but because after living overseas for years, the explanation just feels way too simple. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. I don't consider myself a passport bro. Never have, never will. I didn't move overseas because I couldn't get women. I didn't wake up one day and say, you know what? Let me fly halfway across the world because women don't like me. That wasn't my story. And honestly, I don't think that's a story for a lot of men living overseas. But somewhere along the way, the internet decided that every man who leaves this country must be running from something. Running from rejection. Running from failure. Running from women. And maybe some men are, let's keep it real. Some men absolutely move overseas chasing women. That happens. But what I find interesting is how people take one example and try to apply it to everybody. That's where the conversation starts falling apart. Because life is usually a lot more complicated than internet labels. I've met men overseas who are married. I've met men overseas who are divorced. I've met men overseas who are retired. I've met entrepreneurs, veterans, business owners, guys who wanted adventure, guys who wanted peace, guys who simply got tired of doing the same thing every day. And yet somehow the internet reduces all of them to, he got no game. And I gotta be honest, the argument never really makes sense to me. Because if a man is willing to leave everything familiar behind, move across the world, adapt to a different culture, learn a different way of life, and build a life from scratch somewhere else, does that sound like somebody who's lacking confidence? Or does that sound like somebody willing to take a risk most people wouldn't? That's what I want to talk about today. Not passport bros, not culture wars, not who right, not who wrong. I want to talk about why I think people misunderstand men who choose to live overseas. And maybe why this whole no game conversation misses the bigger picture. One thing I've noticed about social media, people love simple explanations. Simple explanations make life easier. Simple explanations require less thinking. If somebody loses weight, people say they got lucky. If somebody gets rich, people say they cheated. If somebody moves overseas, people say it's because of women. I had to come inside, y'all. It started raining too hard. One thing about Medellín, they don't lie when they say Medellín is like, what they call it? Some kind of like spring, everyday spring type of thing. I forget the actual nickname, but anyway, let's get back to the subject. Where was I? So everything gets reduced down to one explanation. One label, one box. Take me for example. I've lived in multiple countries. I've experienced different cultures, different lifestyles, different environments. Was meeting women part of that experience? Of course. I'm a straight man. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that women don't exist. But if somebody thinks that that's the only reason I spent years living overseas, they haven't been paying attention. Because there are days when women aren't even part of the conversation. Days when I'm thinking about my future, my health, my peace of mind, my finances, my next move, my purpose. That's real life. And that's why I think the internet gets it wrong. Now let's talk about this word everybody keeps throwing around. Game. Because every time somebody says, man, move overseas because they got no game, I always wonder, what does that actually mean? Seriously, what does game mean? Is it confidence? Is it charisma? Is it knowing how to talk to women? Is it being comfortable socially? Because depending on who you ask, the definition changes every time. Some people think game means walking up to a woman and getting her phone number. Some people think game means being smooth. Some people think game means knowing the right things to say. But here's what I find interesting. The same people who say moving overseas means you have no game rarely talks about the confidence it actually takes to move overseas. Think about it. Most people wouldn't even move to another city. Forget another country. Most people stay within a few miles of where they grew up. Nothing wrong with that. But let's be real. Packing up your life, getting on a plane, and rebuilding from scratch in a different country takes a certain level of confidence too. That ain't easy. It ain't comfortable. And it definitely ain't for everybody. I know people who's scared to eat at a restaurant by themselves, scared to travel by themselves, scared to leave their comfort zone. So when somebody tells me a man has no confidence because he moved overseas, I gotta question that logic. Because moving overseas is one of the biggest risks I've ever taken. And I've taken a few risks in my life. The funny thing is, a lot of people making these arguments had actually never done it. They never sold their stuff. Never left their routine. Never started over. Never figured things out in a foreign country. But somehow they're experts on why other people do it. And look, I'm not saying every man living overseas is some fearless adventurer. That's not true either. What I am saying is this. Life is more complicated than internet stereotypes. Some men move overseas because they're retired. Some because they're curious. Some because they want a better quality of life. Some because they want to stretch their money a little further. Some because they simply want a new experience. And yes, some men move because of women. That's reality too. But why is that the only group people focus on? That's what I don't understand. Now let me talk about myself for a minute. Because people always assume they know your story. I spent over 20 years in the military. Yeah, 20 years. I'm showing my age now. By the time I retired, I wasn't sitting around thinking, man, I need to leave America because women don't like me. That wasn't even on my radar. What I wanted was something different, something new, something outside the routine I've been living for decades. I wanted adventure. I wanted experience. I wanted to see what life looked like outside the environment I've always known. And if you've ever spent years doing the same thing, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes it ain't about running away. Sometimes it's about running towards something. That's a big difference. And I think people confuse those two things all the time. When I moved overseas, I wasn't searching for women. I was searching for perspective. I wanted to experience different cultures, different people, different ways of thinking. I wanted to challenge myself because growth usually happens when you're uncomfortable, not when you're sitting in the same place doing the same thing every day. And here's the part people don't think about. Living overseas isn't a vacation, not when you actually live there. Eventually the excitement wears off. Eventually the novelty disappears. Eventually life becomes life again. Still gotta pay bills. Still gotta solve problems. Still gotta deal with stress. Still still gotta figure things out. So if somebody thinks about moving overseas as some magical cheat code, they don't really understand what living overseas actually is. One thing I've learned after years abroad is your problems usually get on a plane with you. That's real. If you were unhappy before you move, you're probably going to be unhappy after you move. If you were insecure before you move, those same insecurities will probably follow you. A different country doesn't magically fix your life. A different country just gives you a different environment. What you do with that environment is up to you. And I think that's something a lot of people miss completely, because they assume the location is the whole story, when really the person matters more than the location. And that brings me to something else I've noticed. There's a double standard in this conversation that nobody really talks about. And once you see it, it's hard to ignore, because depending on where somebody moves, people judge them completely different. And that's where this conversation starts getting really interesting. Now here's where things get interesting, because I've noticed there's a double standard when it comes to this conversation. Let's say somebody moves to Paris. People say, wow, that's cultured. That's sophisticated. That's exciting. Somebody moves to Italy. People say, living a dream. Enjoying life, experiencing the world. Somebody moves to Spain. People call it adventure, growth, culture. But let a man move to Thailand or Colombia or the Philippines, and suddenly the conversation changes. Now people want to become psychologists. Now everybody got theories. Everybody think that they know exactly why he moved there. He couldn't get women. He got no game. He's running away. And every time I hear that, I wonder why people are so uncomfortable with the idea that somebody simply chose a different lifestyle. Because that's really what we're talking about. Choice. Some people choose suburbs. Some choose big cities. Some choose overseas. Why is one choice automatically respected and another one automatically questioned? That's something I never understood. And let's be honest, a lot of people judging these decisions have never actually lived overseas. They visited maybe, taking a vacation, maybe, because living somewhere and vacationing somewhere are two completely different things. When you actually live somewhere, you start seeing the good and the bad. You see the reality, not the Instagram version, not the YouTube version, the real version. And that's when you realize most of these internet arguments are built on assumptions, not experience. Now let's keep it real, because I don't want this video to sound one-sided. Some men absolutely do move overseas because of women. This is true. Some men come overseas chasing fantasies. Some come overseas thinking every problem in their life is gonna magically disappear. Some come overseas completely unprepared. I've seen it myself. But here's where people lose me. They take those examples and apply them to everybody. Imagine doing that with anything else. Imagine saying every man who goes to the gym is insecure, or every entrepreneur is greedy, or every traveler is running from something. Sounds ridiculous, right? Because human beings are more complicated than that. People move for all kinds of reasons. Retirement, adventure, cost of living, peace of mind, business opportunities, relationships, culture, experience. Life isn't one-dimensional, and neither are the people living it. One thing living overseas taught me is how different people really are. I met guys overseas who barely date. I met guys overseas who spend all their time in the gym. I met guys overseas building businesses. I met guys overseas learning different languages. I met guys overseas who are happier than they've ever been in their whole life. And I met some who are miserable too. Because location doesn't determine happiness. People do. A different country might give you a different environment, but it can't give you purpose. It can't give you discipline. It can't give you self-respect. Those things still gotta come from you. You know what's funny? After all these years overseas, women aren't even the biggest thing I've learned. Not even close. What living overseas taught me was adaptability. It taught me patience, humility, perspective. It taught me how to be uncomfortable, how to figure things out, how to solve problems when nobody else around me thinks the same way I do. That's growth, real growth. Living overseas forced me to become more flexible mentally. Because when you're outside your comfort zone, you either adapt or you struggle. There really isn't much in between. And one thing I started realizing is most people don't actually want freedom. They want familiarity. Freedom sounds great until it comes with uncertainty. Freedom sounds great until you gotta make decisions yourself. Freedom sounds great until you can't blame nobody else for your situation. That's one thing I respect about people who build their life overseas. Not because they're special, not because they're better, but because they're willing to step into uncertainty. And most people won't do that. Living overseas also taught me something else. People see what they want to see. If somebody thinks that men move overseas because they have no game, nothing I say is going to change their mind. And honestly, that's okay. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. But opinions and reality aren't always the same thing. And that's why I wanted to make this video. So let me wrap this up. I don't consider myself a passport bro. Never have. I'm just a man who decided he wanted a different life experience, different environment, different perspective. And after living overseas for some years, I can tell you this. The no game argument is probably one of the laziest explanations people can use. Not because it's never true. Sometimes it is, but because life is bigger than that. People are bigger than that. Experience is bigger than that. Some men move overseas chasing women. Some men move overseas chasing peace. Some men move overseas chasing adventure. Some move chasing freedom. And some men simply just want to see what's out there before their time is up. At the end of the day, everybody gets one life. One. And if somebody decides to spend that life exploring the world, living somewhere different, and creating a lifestyle that makes sense to them, I don't see weakness in that. I see somebody making a choice. And whether people agree with that choice or not is a completely different conversation. But anyway, drop a comment below. Do you guys think men go overseas because they have no game? Or do you guys think that the internet oversimplifies that conversation? I'm curious. Catch you guys in the next video.